All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest seminar from the U.S. Society of Ecological Economics. I'm John Palomeni. I'm the current president of the organization, and we are proud to have uh, a repeat speaker, Alejandro Agafonow. He's a professor at the ESCA School of Management in France. He's no stranger to us. He regularly attends our seminars and always has something good to say or good comments or questions. And we're very much looking forward to his seminar today. The one he did earlier was excellent, and I'm sure this one will be just as good. So thank you, Alejandro, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be an attendee, a regular attendee, and every now and then to have the floor too. Um, and today I would like to share with you the research findings about a company, a corporation, who has been kind of under the radar during more than 2 decades. And I will try to reflect a little bit about why that's the case. Very few people have actually understand what's going on. And that's the objective of today's seminar, to try to understand, to open the black box of the firm. The firm tends to be a black box in economics. Ecological economics is no different in that sense. But of course, in an effort to build an institutional ecological economics, we have to understand the nuts and bolts of enterprises and how they deal with reducing, taking care, preventing a negative environmental and social impact. So John will share with you, or did already through the chat, the paper in case you want to peruse it. And the paper in question is this: Overhauling Multinationals for the Anthropocene, how a rogue subsidiary offers a blueprint for sustainable development, written together with my colleague Maribel Perez. Um, so I've structured the presentation in essentially 6 parts. We are going to start with a quick look at the company's history, is, let's say, the human component of the presentation for you to understand what's going on. But we will move very quickly to why mechanisms. We use a mechanism-based methodology. We are going to turn, of course, to how the archetypical multinational enterprise looks like or works, or how it is organized, to move on in part 4 to what is specific about Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's is just one subsidiary from Unilever. I will tell you more about it in a moment. Then, coming to an end, I will tell you something about methodology, why mechanisms is actually connected to methodology, but I wanted to split in two, perhaps not to make it too dry. And we're going to finish with some questions and answers. Hopefully you will have them. Let me return to the presentation. So a quick look at the company's history. Of course, everybody knows Ben & Jerry's. Who hasn't eaten the ice creams of Ben & Jerry's? Ben & Jerry's was founded by these two folks, Mr. Ben Cohen and Mr. Jerry Greenfield, back to the 1978, if I remember well. They were hippies, as far as I understand, who tried to understand who wanted to make a difference in this world. They learned how to prepare ice creams by correspondence. There was no internet, at least not outside military facilities at the time. So they learned how to prepare, how to make ice creams by correspondence, and decided to venture into this adventure of making ice creams. The company, it was founded in Vermont, in the US. The company eventually went public in Vermont. They actually sold shares. As far as I understand, they invited potential investors, local investors. They offered them samples of ice creams. It was a rather cheerful gathering to explain what the company stood for. And in the year 2000, something amazing happened. Uh, they had they sold the company to Unilever, which is this big multinational. But they didn't do it without, let's say, strings attached. This is perhaps one of the chapters in the history of corporations and companies that offers an exciting perspective into how to engineer incredible commitments and countervailing powers to prevent multinationals changing a company that was known already at the time for having credibly paving the way of doing business in a responsible way, in a mindful way, how to prevent a multinational from killing that spirit and from killing that practice. I'm going to tell you a lot about it in a moment. So what I am surprised about is that the literature is very much about, of course, the story of Ben and Jerry is very interesting, very colorful. And many people ask themselves, why did Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield sell the company to Unilever? Why not keeping it in their hands? After all, they had a structure that allowed them to actually keep control of the company. The company, who had publicly traded, had a dual stock structure and a staggered board, and there were special stocks with preferential voting rights in the hands of a foundation that Ben and Jerry controlled. This actually gave them the leeway to make the fundamental decisions, even if they were against the will of a majority of shareholders. This literature essentially says that they were compelled by the fact that they were publicly traded to sell to Unilever. But they very often overlook the fact that these safeguards existed in the company already, these corporate governance safeguards. And most importantly, they were not incorporated in Delaware, where, of course, Delaware offers one of the most important shareholder-centric corporate governance. Delaware courts stands in favor of shareholders in most of the time. This company, on the other hand, was incorporated in Vermont, a rather progressive state in the US, and the corporate governance is substantially different. So I actually don't buy the idea that they were forced to sell. But what is most important is that the literature is lacking into how Ben and Jerry's was structured in order for that merger between Unilever and Ben and Jerry's to happen. What were the conditions Ben and Jerry's made imperative in order to agree to the selling of the company to Unilever? So let's start with this little history of the company, quick history of the company here, and let me take you to why mechanisms. We use a mechanism-based methodology, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. What are mechanisms? One of the definitions of mechanisms that I like the most come from Linley Darden. She says that mechanisms are entities and activities organized to produce a phenomenon. Activities are the producers of change. Entities are the things that engage in activities. Most importantly, what I found is that colleagues tend to mix up, to confuse mechanisms with mechanical explanations in physics. No, they're actually not the same. Have a look at what Thomas Levinson says. He says that mechanisms are not mathematical laws like Newton's law of gravitation that was formulated without saying just how that force imparts its impulse to whatever it touched. No levers here, no gears, no mover, prime or not. Mechanisms are just the opposite. It's everything about levers, gears, and mover. Mechanisms cannot be confused with mechanical explanations in physics. So it is important to be aware of, we are not talking about here, social scientists tend to blame other social scientists that emulate physics. They believe that they are envy of physics. Well, I have the impression that that accusation in this particular context is beyond the point, because mechanism-based explanations are actually the hallmark of Just a little second. Oops. Let me return to you. Share. Mechanisms-based explanations are the hallmark of the life sciences, as you can see in the quotation from Ernest Nagel. Mechanisms are the hallmark of life sciences, which deal with the actual functions of definite components in concretely given living systems. Aren't, after all, enterprises and societies living systems? Perhaps there is room for bringing mechanisms-based explanations to ecological economics. And there are good reasons for that. For example, have a look at what Simon Levin, he's a well-known ecologist, what he says about mechanisms. Without an understanding of mechanisms, Simon says, one must evaluate each new stress on each new system de novo without any scientific basis for extrapolation. Extrapolating is so important. We cannot do it based on case studies. They have a lot of limitations when it comes to extrapolations, and it is not always possible to do it with correlational studies. I'm going to tell you more about it in a moment. Mechanisms are fundamental, and in biology and biomedical sciences, for example, it's amazing how biologists, physicians, in biochemistry, they refuse to accept findings, results based only on correlational studies. They always ask, but what's going on here? What is the mechanism behind? Which brings me to another statement from Lindley Darden. She says, phylogenetic inferences based on homology provide a sounder basis for generalization than mere induction by simple enumeration. And here I want to tell you a little anecdote related to Karl Popper. Everybody knows him. He's a philosopher of science. He said back to some years ago, he said that no matter how many instances of white swans we may have observed, this does not justify the conclusion that all swans are white. Actually, back to the 15th century, Europeans were not acquainted with black swans. We thought that after seeing so many instances of swans, induction by enumeration, we took for granted that swans were actually white. But in reality, in Australia, in the south of Australia, swans are black because melanin taints their feathers as an adaptation to their environment. So this is the anecdote that Karl Popper uses to invite us to think about the risks of induction by simple enumeration, correlational studies. We all know about the principle of correlation doesn't imply causation. And the example of the black and white swans, I think that are very, very compelling to help us understand what are the limits of induction by simple enumeration. Let me return to these. And to finish this section about mechanisms, I would like to invite you to consider, for example, social mechanisms. This book is one of the first ones compiling works and reflections about the use of mechanisms in the social sciences. But when it comes to ecological economics, I would like to invite you also to read this paper from Herman Daly on economics as a life science. To be fair, Herman Daly doesn't advocate the use of mechanism-based explanations. I don't know if he was aware of them back to 1968, but he understood perhaps the importance of understanding ecological economics as a form of life science. If mechanism-based explanations are so important in life sciences, perhaps there is a room to use them in our discipline. Which brings me to the section number 3 of this presentation. Let me tell you now what the findings of this research are. So what we have here is a mechanism schema of the archetypical multinational. This mechanism schema has been built based on extant knowledge, organizational economics, industrial economics knowledge, transaction cost economics about multinationals, and specifically divisionalized organizations or multidivisional organizations, which is the jargon these gentlemen use to refer to multinationals. As you can see, 2 of them, Oliver Williamson and Paul Milgrom, they are aware Nobel Prize in Economics, but many of them are very well known. Henry Mintzberg in the area of organizational studies. Alfred Chandler is a historian or was a historian, among others. But instead of let's say, taking you through the labyrinthic structure of this mechanism schema, let me do it using a subassembly of modules. It will be easier for me to communicate the kernels of what the archetypical multinational stands for. What do we have here in the subassembly? Consider first the shareholders and the stakeholders at large. Look that in this mechanism schema, we don't have stakeholders. It will be evident for a reason that I will share in a moment. So first of all, we have that in the archetypical multinational, well, shareholders vote for board members to sit on the board of directors. But it is rare to see actually stakeholders, especially if we're talking about external, outside stakeholders, non-equity stakeholders, to appoint board members at all. So this icon shows kind of representative of nature, if we like, or board members that stand for the importance of being careful with our impact on nature. They normally don't exist in the archetypical corporation. Of course, in Europe, we have co-determination. It is common in some European countries that we have a representative of employees on the board, but they don't necessarily stand for nature. And not in every European country with co-determination, employees can vote for or elect board representatives. It is indeed the case of Germany, that in my opinion is the most ambitious co-determination system. Let's continue, let's move on. Of course, in the archetypical multinational, what you're going to see is that a lambda shows you that shareholders have a low-cost exit option. They can sell their shares in a stock exchange and leave the company very easily. But it's not always the case of stakeholders. Imagine in a specific city, region, locality, what does it mean to exit when it comes to building a relationship with a company operating on your backyard? That easy way of leaving a company, cutting ties with it, is actually not available for stakeholders. And then we have, of course, mu, that implies essentially having legal standing vis-a-vis the courts about the internal affairs of the corporation. Shareholders have legal standing concerning the internal affairs of the corporation, but stakeholders don't. Of course, they can have legal standing when it comes to using the legal system and the laws that regulate corporations to contest what corporations are doing, given the existence of those laws, for example, environmental regulation. But these are matters that fall outside the internal affairs of the corporation. We are talking about here endogenous versus exogenous ways to compel a corporation to comply with certain standards, ethical or regulatory standards. Let me continue. What we have here, and this is perhaps the most important aspect of component module of the working of a corporation. Beta, in this case, means that corporations have found a way to manage, administer a large number of subsidiaries with a very streamlined mechanisms. For example, Henry Mintzberg says essentially that they monitor them after the facts are known. How do they do it? Essentially, they have reduced the whole technostructure to monitor work to a form of financial economic monitoring. They essentially monitor the profitability of those subsidiaries. The subsidiaries would be these little companies that are populating the operating core of the corporation. And actually, Unilever, Ben& Jerry's is just one of these subsidiaries. Unilever has more than 400 subsidiaries operating around the world. That's a lot. Imagine the problems of bounded rationality. Managers sitting on the board of directors, able to oversee what 400 subsidiaries are doing and how they are performing around the world without a technostructure that streamlines that monitoring with essentially an exercise of rating their performance, as you can see here, that wouldn't be possible. Humans, of course, suffer. Organizational economists have made an analogy with these economies of scale. So there are also these economies to management. When a multinational grows so large, these economies of management, triggered by boundary rationality, implies that there must be a substantial change in the way those subsidiaries are managed. And here is part of the problem. In the end, when you are rating, monitoring subsidiaries, their performance based on financial indicators, what are the chances that you can actually push them to overstep, push them to betray fundamental principles of social and environmental responsibility? Perhaps the big problem of multinational, one of the most important problems of multinationals may lie precisely in this component, which is an organizational breakthrough that happened at the turn of the 20th century. This is what we call the principle of divisionalization. Before, the seams that connected the board with the operating core were functional in nature. But what multinationals stand for today and what was discovered back to the turn of the 20th century was precisely that those seams could be rearranged, rethought in a different way, turning the monitoring after the facts into a financial evaluation, essentially. And then, of course, we have that the board of directors designates the CEOs that will manage those subsidiaries. We don't have that in the case of traditional multinationals. In the case of the archetypical multinationals concerning stakeholders, they lack countervailing powers. The companies lack credible commitments to tell us that the company will be managed for the sake of the interests of these stakeholders, and they cannot pull any string to make those multinationals be managed differently, except resorting to standing laws for the state to regulate them, to tie the regulation screw, if you like. Another step concerning these findings is what Ben& Jerry's looks like. We have already a view of what the archetypical multinational is about, but look about Unilever and Ben& Jerry's. Again, this is what you can find, the mechanism schema in the paper, but I want to bring your attention to just a subassembly of modules. And here, the surprising stuff will come. At least I was very much surprised, and I look forward to hearing your reactions in the questions and answers part. What we have here, of course, Unilever, we have the shareholders themselves, but unlike the stakeholders at large, which are essentially contingent, if you like, disenfranchised It's difficult to bring them together if there are so many with many different interests. What we have is a group of Class I directors. We are talking about here a definite or a certain stakeholder. Who are these Class I directors? I will tell you more about that in a moment. Let me tell you very quickly through what Unilever looks like. Unilever itself is not very different from the template of the traditional multinational. They elect, of course, they vote for board members, they have an exit option at low cost. It is shareholders in this particular case who have legal standing. And here comes the interesting thing. Of course, they still rate the more than 400 subsidiaries around the world with this very streamlined kind of financial technostructure. But surprise, surprise, they alone do not say or do not designate the CEO of every subsidiary. Most of them, yes, but not in the case of Ben and Jerry's. We're going to see what happened in a moment. What they do, the board of directors of Unilever, is to designate a so-called Class U director. It's actually the only representative sitting on the board of directors of Ben and Jerry's as a subsidiary of Unilever. This is the first striking element that tells us there is Ben and Jerry's breaks the mold here. Ben and Jerry's takes a distance from what's going on in the archetypical multinationals. Now to the side of the stakeholders. Who are Class I directors? Class I directors are, let me tell you more about it. They are 9 individuals who essentially are self-perpetuating. This is what delta means. Inside the board of Ben & Jerry's, we have a group that have been created, designated with a mechanism typical of a nonprofit, because nonprofits are, by definition, ownerless enterprises. You don't have anybody casting a vote to decide who are the members of the board of trustees of nonprofits. This is what in the literature we call a self-perpetuating mechanisms. And surprisingly enough, these 9 class I directors enjoy or have this self-perpetuating nature. We don't have neither shareholders nor the board members of Unilever deciding who those class I directors are. Of course, there are, in the merger agreement, they are invited to have good faith consultation with the Class U director to appoint Class I directors. But it is the Class I directors who decide who will fill vacant positions. This is revolutionary enough already. Let me continue with this. What happens here? Of course, the Class I directors, they designate 2 members in the appointment committee, which together with the Class U director are in charge, or the committee is in charge, to designating the CEO of Ben & Jerry's. In what multinational have you seen that stakeholders partake in the designation of the CEO? Of course, we are not talking about the CEO of Unilever. We are talking about the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, but that's already a breakthrough. Naturally, the CEO will be there to oversee, let's say, profitability goals, but to the extent that the appointment of the CEO was in a committee with 2 Class I directors that do not respond to the shareholders of Unilever, together with the only representative of Unilever, we can imagine already that those CEOs will be very, very special. They perhaps may not be overly focused on profitability only. But the story doesn't end there. Look at this. Now what we see is that Epsilon is fundamental here. It is the Class I directors who, as per the merger agreement between Ben and Jerry's and Unilever in the 2000s, they are in charge of overseeing fundamental drivers of corporate and environmental responsibility. Let me tell you more about this because this is exciting and incredible. We are not talking about here about uh, environmental impact per se, environmental or social impact per se. Of course, there is an effort in Ben and Jerry's to track metrics concerning environmental and social impact. But my point is that by being in charge of drivers, my point is that they don't remain in the surface of the phenomenon. They go back to the root cause of what causes potential issues of social and environmental problems. And I would like to share with you just a little quotation from the merger agreement for you to understand what are those environmental drivers. The merger agreement says the following: the company board may prevent any action by the CEO. The company board, we are talking about the board with a majority of Class I directors, huh? The company board may prevent any action by the CEO in the areas of new product introduction, the changing of product standards and specifications, the approval of the content of marketing materials, and the licensing or other use of the Ben& Jerry's trademark. That in each case, a majority of the company board, and the majority is in the hands, of course, of Class I directors, determines to be inconsistent with the essential integrity of the brand. What I like the most, perhaps the most important root cause of social and environmental irresponsibility is precisely the product standards and specifications. It is there where directors bound to shareholders adjudicate decisions to cut corners, decisions that end up either having a negative impact on employees, on society, on the environment. And it is these drivers which, surprisingly enough, is, according to the merger agreement, in the hands of Class I directors that were designated by Ben& Jerry's back to the 2000s. Of course, the board has changed over time. They are self-perpetuating, but there are reasons why a Class I director may decide to quit at some point. But because they are self-perpetuating, what we can expect is that the initial Class I directors had a mindset that allowed them to find for replacements that were like-minded, if you like, committed to social and environmental causes. And this is what you can see when you have a look at the board of directors. This is the profile they have. There are people with a long track record of social and environmental activism, most of them. Something that is a profile that is rather strange when it comes to the traditional board member in multinational corporation and other for-profit organizations. And this is all reinforced with an injunction. Remember that stakeholders normally don't have legal standing when it comes to the internal affairs of the corporation. But thanks to this injunction created, Rho and P, this injunction created during the merger of Ben& Jerry's and Unilever, actually, they can make sure that Unilever doesn't backtrack on the commitments they agreed to back in the year 2000 when they signed the merger agreement. A few years ago, when I saw these, it was mind binding for me. And we can, of course, ask ourselves, after more than 2 decades, is it actually possible that the board and the Class I directors remain committed to the original roadmap designed, engineered by Ben and Jerry's themselves. Look at what every now and then there are certain kind of conflicts between Unilever's board and Ben and Jerry's board. And every time these events help shed light on what's going on. Is the board, are Class I directors alive and kicking? I think that there is evidence to support that, to believe that that is the case. So the last event, perhaps you have seen on the news in the US, happened because Ben and Jerry's took a public stand in favor of human rights in the Gaza Strip. As a consequence, we have the reaction of the UK Lawyers for Israel, who is a pressure group that in the UK did the following. They essentially reached out to the London Stock Exchange with a complaint. What was the complaint about? It reads, and I'm going to quote what this organization posits about Ben & Jerry's. It appears that Unilever has a rogue division in the United States known as Ben & Jerry's Homemade, which has been structured so as to evade normal corporate governance practices. And they continue, what is taking place is a failure of corporate governance, which is inherent in the structure of Unilever. As noted above, it appears that Unilever has delegated important high-risk decisions to an unelected, of course, they have a self-perpetuating mechanisms, unelected board, which is accountable to nobody. This is from 2021 when the complaint was filed in the London Stock Exchange. And well, of course, I disagree with the negative outlook that they give to this structure. The UK Lawyers for Israel had different interests that they are defending, but it is precisely this design that I'm trying to convey, to communicate to you that reveals the real credible commitments, the imperative credible commitments, to distinguish them from motivational credible commitments, the imperative nature of the credible commitments that Ben & Jerry's created back to the year 2000 with the engineering of that very peculiar merger agreement. We are coming to an end concerning the findings. I am monitoring the time, but it would be interesting to know. Remember, last year, I had the opportunity, the pleasure to be here with you and present research also in the tradition of mechanism-based explanations about Patagonia. I haven't done a systematic, or we haven't done a systematic comparison between both, but just for the sake of going in that direction, even if we're not going to fully to extract important conclusions from these. Look at this little comparison. Those interested in having a look at the presentation of Patagonia, you have the video, of course, in the YouTube channel of this seminar. So we have here that in the place of shareholders of Unilever, we will have the Patagonia Purpose Trust itself. Of course, in the case of those shareholders, they have voting that allow them to elect board members. The relationship between the Patagonia Purpose Trust and the board of Patagonia Works, which is a company, is perhaps closer, is tighter. That's why I illustrated with alpha, which is a sort of control. Patagonia itself is also a multidivisional organization, but unlike the 400 subsidiaries of Unilever, Patagonia has only, if I remember well, I may be mistaken, but they have around 7 to 10 subsidiaries. So the problem of bounded rationality and these economies to management are less serious when it comes to managing those subsidiaries in a more socially, environmentally meaningful way. Interesting enough, the Patagonia Purpose Trust in principle doesn't have the option to exit through the stock exchange. For a starter, it's not a publicly traded corporation. It's not a publicly traded company. And we, of course, conjecture that the articles of incorporation will prevent a purpose trust from, of course, selling shares, betraying the purpose created in the articles of incorporation of the company. What else? Well, of course, remember that Unilever doesn't designate the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, but of course, the board and Patagonia, naturally, the Patagonia Trust will designate in principle the CEO of Patagonia, Patagonia Works. The Class U director doesn't make sense here. And what we have is that instead of the Class I directors or stakeholders, Patagonia will have the Holdfast Collective, which is this environmental nonprofit organization which holds 98% of the shares of Patagonia, non-voting shares. The appointment committee doesn't make sense here. The injunction doesn't make sense here. Yet the legal standing of the Holdfast Collective will actually come with holding those shares. They have rights to the lion's shares of the dividends of Patagonia in order to invest that money in environmental causes. So again, this is just a preliminary, just putting together side by side, perhaps invite thinking that must still be done more systematically, but allows you to see some of the interesting nuts and bolts, cogs and wheels that these companies have, and how they depart from the traditional template, from the archetypical multinational corporation. What is the problem being solved in all this? At a more theoretical level, and again, we are coming to an end, we're talking about the reduction of the marginal cost of engaging with one more multinational borne by stakeholders across the value chain. The problem with the stakeholders in the traditional archetypical multinational is that, of course, they are not definite or ascertainable. They are, by definition, contingent, and therefore the lack of enfranchisement will actually hinder mobilization to hold multinationals accountable for what they do. Every now and then, of course, we have more definite kind of stakeholders, NGOs that do a wonderful job denouncing what's going on, litigating against multinational for environmental destruction. But the mechanism that I just showed you actually reduces the marginal cost of that engagement. This is perhaps the way we should explore more seriously. To what extent? Imagine in a world where we take these mechanisms and make them mandatory in certain kind of organizations, in certain kind of companies, the ones that are more likely to drift away from those social and environmental commitments. And last but not least, of course, we have, in the case of Patagonia, an important problem solved is the increase in the opportunity cost of not redressing a breach of purpose by designating a certain beneficiary, which is the Holdfast Collective, whose interest lies in nature's preservation. The opportunity cost of not taking action in the case of the Holdfast Collective, which is a definite, ascertainable beneficiary, are too high. So they are likely to take action in case the Patagonia Purpose Trust somehow lose sight of what the company should do. 546, I'm going to skip a few important methodological issues. Perhaps we'll have opportunity to discuss them in the future. But I just want to bring your attention to the type of data that we're using here. Remember our discussion to black swans, black and white swans, Popper, Darden. And of course, we have data about events. It's not the case of our research. These represent occurrences that happen at a specific time and place. Uh, Correlational studies, induction by enumeration is a case in point. And of course, perhaps some of the sources of the most reliable data about events are demographic data from national censuses, as well as macroeconomic data from national and multinational agencies. These are important sources of data, of course, but most economics, and unfortunately most ecological economics, still builds on this kind of data. Perhaps in an effort of triangulation, and given the currency that life sciences has in ecology and ecological economics, we should start using the kind of data more akin to mechanism-based explanations. We're talking about dispositional data. These data represent tangible or intangible entities that exist independently of time. There is a qualification to this independently of time here. The point is that science aims at nomological knowledge. The idea is to build knowledge that allows us to understand how these mechanisms presented today can be replicated beyond Patagonia and Ben and Jerry's. And this is why the findings are expected or are supposed, in a mechanism-like fashion, are supposed to be independent from time and place. Of course, they have specific ideographic manifestations in Ben and Jerry's and in Patagonia in a specific time and place. But the idea is to aim at that universal outlook and see how we can, in an effort of extrapolation, how we can actually replicate those structures beyond the specific, very few cases that we see have blaze a trail in that direction. So an example of dispositional data, a commonsensical example, is the joint operation of a wooden board and a handle when fitting into a door frame to prevent passage into a building. This is a nomothetic definition of a door. No matter what specific door, in what specific building we're talking about, we know what the mechanism of a door operates and what are the entities that perform activities to fulfill a function. And this is the beauty of dispositional data that ecologists recognize and life sciences appreciate very much. Perhaps, again, in an effort of triangulation, we should start bringing more mechanism-based explanations to ecological economics. This is a way to represent the data, the dispositional data we use in this research. This is a Porphyrian tree or object hierarchy. It is a tool to classify instance-level parts, entities, or individual denizens of the reality of a field of study. Whether in library catalogs, in restaurant menus, in functional classifications of genes, or in the directory structure used by the operating systems of our computers, such sorting is required. There is just a little step from this to turning these mechanisms into a computational model of Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, and the more nomological universal model that perhaps allegedly could be replicated somewhere else. And well, we just arrived to the time of questions and answers. But before I give you the floor, may I just bring to your attention two questions that John and Eric articulated last year, because I think these two questions I wasn't able to answer meaningfully, but at the same time they are relevant for today's presentation. John asked, can this kind of structure, in reference to Patagonia, be used to safeguard resources to make sure they are not overly mined or abused? And Eric Norman asked, can this tackle the problem of entities that benefit trading carbon offsets, while entities that benefit from trading carbon offsets, while nature is the one losing out. And the answer is in the affirmative. What I would like to communicate is that these mechanisms are helping us to understand how to govern, how to create endogenous governance mechanisms, govern enterprises for the sake of embracing and bringing to reality social and environmental objectives from the inside. We are not talking about the traditional perspective of ecological economics of regulating enterprises from the outside. This is not an invitation to quit regulation. Regulation is necessary, but we know also that regulation has gaps. And if we are in this field, it's because we uh, agonize about the gaps in regulations, and we see how the planet is being strained by enterprises that do not comply with those regulations. Perhaps it's time to take an endogenous perspective and reinforce what governments through public policy are doing with an endogenous, from the inside the organization perspective that allows us to understand how decision making is adjudicated for the sake of non-equity stakeholders, nature included. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Alejandro. That's very interesting. Corporate social responsibility, very important and under attack right now, but nonetheless still very important. So, very timely presentation and paper. Um, there's a couple questions, comments already in the chat. John Sorrentino, go ahead.
So in 1992, Ben and Jerry's joined the Series organization to follow the principles. Are you aware of the Series principles?
Can you repeat again the question, John? In 1992, you mentioned?
Yes, Ben and Jerry's joined the Series. It adopted the Series principles.
The series principle. No, I'm not aware about that initiative.
Okay, here it comes. Here it comes in the chat.
Good, good. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's called the Coalition of Environmentally Responsible Economies. It's an acronym for this nonprofit organization. So companies like Patagonia and Ben and Jerry's would join this worldwide to show that they're going to operate their businesses with respect to the environment and be open and transparent in all the things they do. So I just wanted to know if you knew how that translated into their agreement with Unilever, since they were strongly committed to the 10 principles I just put in the chat.
Yes. I've read the agreement entirely, and they don't make any reference to these or any other initiative. Perhaps it's not the space, such an agreement, a merger agreement is not a space to make reference to these kind of things. Of course, they are explicit about their commitment to social and environmental impact. But what is most important is not about good deeds. Those commitments manifest in a specific structure. And this is the beauty of Ben and Jerry's and Patagonia too. Structures that help to adjudicate decision making for the sake of making those commitments a reality. If there are companies from which we could possibly believe those commitments are being endorsed, it is perhaps Ben and Jerry's and Patagonia, because shareholders have been disabled. The influence of shareholders have been curtailed, disabled to a large extent. It doesn't mean that Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's in this particular case, has not been under extreme pressure. Ben and Jerry's has recently filed lawsuits against Unilever because Unilever has tried to silence them concerning the problem in the Gaza Strip. In the Financial Times report, tactics like freezing or stopping paying the salary of Class I directors. So my point is that those initiatives are very much welcome. There are many different initiatives that are very much worthy, but I am concerned, for example, about seeing mainstream corporations, which are normally not deemed socially responsible, kind of appropriating these initiatives, participating in these initiatives, and actually claiming to donations. How many, what percentage of the profits of a corporation will be donated to environmental and social cause? Even Amazon today is doing that. Paying a decent living wage in the US, where in many states there are not minimum wage, or those minimum wage have not been updated in a long time. Patagonia was Ben & Jerry's was a trailblazer, but nowadays even Google does it, even Alphabet does it. My point is that beyond those initiatives, I'm not speaking against them. We should think about how those initiatives translate in imperative credible commitments, manifest in the structures in the corporate governance of these organizations that affect the way decisions are being adjudicated. Thanks, John, for bringing that to my attention.
Are there any other? Oh, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, Unilever hit them at a pretty strategic spot by trying to undo this, let's say, not pay the salaries of the I-class people.
Look, it hurts. It hurts, but Ben & Jerry's is not silent. They continue using the injunction that I show you to litigate and say, look, we had an agreement, and the courts are there to make that agreement a reality. And this is why Unilever is now trying to get rid of the division where Unilever is located. They tried to sell that division in the last couple of years, but they didn't find a suitable bidder. Perhaps the potential bidders, are afraid of this structure in Ben & Jerry's, although Ben & Jerry's is just one subsidiary within this division of ice creams and refreshments. And they now are exploring, perhaps by the end of this year, they will spin off the division. That is to say, they will issue shares and they will let the division operate independently from Unilever, distributing the shares pro rata among Unilever's shareholders. What is going to happen with Ben & Jerry's in the future? I don't know, but it's a pity that Unilever apparently has not endorsed its commitments manifest in the merger agreement of the 2000.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
There's a question by Carrie King.
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to ask it, but the question is essentially your two examples, I guess, are private companies that sold to the market, if you will, and maintain some sort of governing structure as you've been describing. I'm wondering if there's examples of it going the other way. Are there companies that had a more traditional structure, but they changed to something more sustainable and to have this more of a social governing principle?
Well, Patagonia was a case in point. Until a year ago, it was a privately owned company that had a track record, of course, of good social and environmental citizenship. But they, in a sense, disabled the power that the family had by means of turning the ownership of the company into the hands of a purpose trust. Is the example that I can find, the most recent example that I can find. Of course, there is the case of traditional companies in Scandinavia, here in Europe. Denmark is a case in point. There are many mainstream kind of companies that, surprisingly enough, are being managed by foundations, which are essentially non-profit organizations. Only that, unlike Patagonia and Ben and Jerry's, these companies don't seem to have necessarily a social environment, don't seem to endorse explicitly, or they have not included in the articles of incorporation a mission that linked them to a social or environmental impact. For example, Carlsberg in Denmark is a brewer, a beer making company who is run by a foundation. The family at some point decided to turn the ownership of those traditional for-profit companies into the hands of a foundation. And arguably, the foundation used the dividends of those companies to invest in causes. But there is a problem, always the risk of the foundation asking too much money from a company whose business model is by definition flawed, destroying the planet. Think about the impact on water resources of brewing beer. Is it the case of Carlsberg? I could not tell for sure, but it brings what I'm thinking is about the trade-offs and the apparent tension between a foundation using resources to channel toward charitable causes and a profit-making brewer with a fundamentally damaging business model that may be channeling resources to good causes out of doing something not so good, let's say. So this kind of foundation, traditional for-profit company, is very common in Scandinavia, and especially in Denmark.
Right. So if I just summarize, you're saying it's relatively common for a private company that's owned by one family or a very small number of people to then turn it over to this kind of more multi-person ownership. But maybe we don't know of any examples of an actual publicly traded company that transitions into that type of ownership.
Publicly traded company that transitions in that ownership. Many of the cases that I'm mentioning of Denmark are publicly traded. Carlsberg is a publicly traded corporation. Yeah.
Okay.
Which I would say adds an additional layer of negative elements. The pressure of shareholders pushing Carlsberg to turn a profit while the foundation is using resources to fund charitable causes. The trade-offs there are apparently problematic.
May I add that Ben & Jerry's was publicly traded by the time they adopted series principles.
But in the case of Ben & Jerry's is that they managed to keep shareholders at a distance thanks to three mechanisms that I mentioned at the beginning.
Right.
Dual class stocks, staggered boards, and shares with special voting class in the hands of a foundation controlled by Ben & Jerry's.
There's a question by Robert Day. Go ahead, Robert.
Robert, your mic is...
Yes, I thank you for taking my question. I'm interested in whether corporations could not be substituted by cooperatives. If under an ecological economics, the laws changed to encourage a cooperative style of operation rather than a publicly traded for-profit company. Are there a lot of cooperatives that operate in a similar way to Patagonia, or which have adopted the series principles? And would that be a way to steer the sort of future towards more sustainable processes?
Robert, look, divisionalized organizations, to use the terminology of what fundamentally a multinational is, that are cooperatives. Well, the case of Mondragon in the north of Spain is well known. It's apparently the largest cooperative in the world. And it has a multidivisional organization, naturally, because it's very, very large. of course, there is something inherently positive about cooperatives, and perhaps cooperatives can do a better job than traditional profit-making publicly traded multinationals. However, we should not underestimate the possibility that the interests of, of persons as employees may collide at some point with the interests of persons as consumers of ecological services.
Yeah.
Consider, for example, the case of Volkswagen. Volkswagen has one of the most ambitious co-determination systems. 50% of the board members of Volkswagen, the supervisory board, are employees elected, are representatives elected by employees. And arguably, Volkswagen was engaged in this carbon emission scandal, even having board members who may have been aware of what was going on in the operating core of the company. After all, Volkswagen claims to be operating for the sake of creating employment for the German people. Was the carbon emission scandal just a dirty trick to continue fueling the machine to create employment for the German people? Employees get a benefit, get something positive out of it, but nature was damaged in the process. And not only that, in Europe we have many cooperatives, true, but also some of those cooperatives have been sued by the European watchdog of competition, because some of them have been caught exploiting customers, just like a traditional for-profit monopolies would do. So this is not to say that cooperatives cannot do something better than corporations. I do believe that they can, but we have to be, what I would like to communicate is that we should be realistic about the interest and the governance structure of a cooperative. If it centers narrowly on one stakeholder only, employees, sometimes the interests of those employees may collide with the interests of nature and other non-equity stakeholders.
So you need to insert a mechanism similar to the mechanism in Ben & Jerry's, or
it would be fantastic to see a corporation blazing a cooperative blazing a trail when it comes to harnessing its governance structure in the way somehow that Ben & Jerry's or Patagonia did. That would be fantastic. I don't know if they exist already, but we should be attentive to that possibility. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, we are running out of time, but before we do anything left, I just want to remind everybody that next week will be our next seminar. It will be the ISEE president, Eric Gomez Bagathon, from Norway, and he will be sharing with us, so that will be sure to be an excellent time as well. So with that, I want to thank Alejandro once again for another fascinating presentation seminar. Very excellent.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.